So next up is Dr. Laura Higson-Bliss. Laura is a lecturer in law at Kew University. After Laura attended a conference at Sheffield dealing with creativity in the law school, and after meeting many attendees of this group, Laura revamped her module, Foundations in Law, to include game-based learning. Foundations of Law is a module which covers an introduction to the English legal system for foundation year students. That's level 3. So Laura will talk through 3 examples of game-based learning she has introduced into the module, and will reflect on the highs and lows of bringing creativity into the classroom. So thank you very much, Laura. Off you go.
No, thank you very much. I say game-based learning, but I actually think it's probably more playful learning that I use within the module. So as I said, I went to a creativity in the law school event during the summer to get ideas for foundations of law, to try and revamp it. So a bit like anyone who comes into a law school relatively new, you inherit modules. And because of how late in the year I sort of inherited this module, the first year that I ran it, it was very much a sort of copy and paste job from a previous staff member. And throughout the session, it became very apparent that I just needed to do something a little bit more with the module. And from my perspective, I think foundation year in general, whether you call it foundation year, I know at my old institution they call it something different, I fundamentally believe in that program. I think there's a place for it in all universities because not everyone comes from a traditional educational background, and that's where you need modules like this so that people who the education system is made, in my opinion, for a one size sort of fits all approach, which doesn't necessarily ring true to the people that we teach. And then also it allows for those that want to move careers to get into university if that's what they want to do, which they might have not had opportunity to do in the past. So I'm gonna try and share my PowerPoint screen. It keeps asking me to update things for some reason. See if that works. Oh, that didn't. It's slowly uploading and then crashes. So just while that tries to upload, I think it's doing it now, I'll give you a little bit of background information about the module this semester. So previously it was ran with 2 tutorial groups, and lectures were online because of COVID. That's the decision that was made at the time, and that's how we ran the module in the last academic year. I made the decision this academic year to sort of revamp it and then bring in this sort of playful learning. And when I say it's sort of this playful learning, it is very much back to basics. So there isn't any creation of any technology to bring in these play-based learning mechanisms that I've chosen to use. It is very basics. It might look quite cheap at times because I had no funding for any of this. I've had to either self-fund in some instances, or I've been lucky that the foundation year team, they have managed to get some things through on the stationery order for me. So the demographics for this academic year is that we had 44 students in total, which were all at level 3. They all came from different educational backgrounds. Some had had career breaks, had educational breaks. Some had done other careers and were looking to change. What was very much different this year compared to the previous year is that we had mature students. So in the previous year, we had no mature students. And I know that when I went into the room to give the sort of introductory session, that sort of put me back a bit, and it made me question whether I should be using these mechanisms in my teaching, because obviously at the time, I had in mind one genre of students because that's who I'd taught previously on the module, whereas this was very different. What I did find, though, actually, is that those sort of older students, they actually took to it a lot better than those that I originally sort of aimed this towards. And they actually quite enjoyed the different approach to the teaching. The foundation year is slightly different here at Keele in that it's foundations of law, but not all students on the module will be going on to do a law degree. They are on different programme routes, and just so happens that law falls within their programme routes. So there will be some that are on law, and the majority will have been law. There is also social work and then humanities-based subjects. And that itself is quite challenging because there are some who feel that well, if I'm going to do psychology, for example, or I'm going to do sociology, why am I studying law? And this was why I was trying to bring in this sort of play-based learning, sort of try and challenge some of these approaches to the module. So a bit of inspiration and background then. So like I said, I attended Sheffield University in the summer, and we talked about creativity in the law school, and I came away from that feeling very much inspired and wanting to try and do something completely different, and foundation year seemed like a safe bet to try that out with. There's no sort of curriculum per se in that I have to teach certain subjects. I'm sort of free reign, if you will. And it was also the first module in the semester which I was module leader for. So that makes it a lot easier if you're module leader. You can sort of change these things. I'd also like to say some of the stuff that I have done in this module is very much taken from Alison Shruffers at Warwick University, and I'd like to thank her for all the work that she does. I know she's done some presentations here before on Taskmaster. A lot of what she's done I've tried to incorporate, so very much a thank you to her. So the way in which I reworked the module is that, like I said, we went from lectures and tutorials into one workshop. The reason I did that is because last year there was a massive problem with attendance, and I know for this sort of approach that I wanted to take with the playful learning is that I needed bodies in the room because otherwise it's not going to work. So I made the decision that it would be best to have too many in the room than not enough, and we can sort of work around that. And that worked really well because we always had at least 25 students, normally a bit more, to help get involved, and it worked overall, I would say, quite well. One of the things that I did is I changed the assessment, and in particular, the final assessment was a reflection piece in which I asked students to reflect on 2 of the workshops that they had attended and the games and the skills that we'd done in those workshops, and then sort of link that back to the wider legal sector. You could argue that's sort of a fast and hard approach to force students to attend, but my thinking around it was that actually, if they are attending this anyway, and they should be attending regardless of what the assessment is, why not incorporate it and sort of give them some bonus points, if you will, by making sure that it was somewhat involved in the final assessment. They were given some tasks beforehand, but the majority of the tasks were after the session. So in particular, one of the things that we'll look at around statutory interpretation, I chose not to get them to read about statutory interpretation beforehand because I thought that that might affect the way in which they approach the session. What I also did, and I've actually incorporated it into other parts of my teaching, is I had the radio on in the background, which might sound like something very basic. And it was actually another colleague in the law school who mentioned about that she puts things on in the background. Because I found that if the radio was on, they were more likely to participate in the activities and more likely to talk under the assumption that they don't think I can hear them. That wasn't necessarily always true. And it worked really, really well to get them talking. And I would just say to them, I literally hate silence. So I'm going to put the radio on. So that worked really well. it was underpinned, the whole premise of it, and this was someone who mentioned this at the creativity in the law school event, was that play must be voluntary, so no one was forced to do anything. And in particular, I was very much, and it's very much my moral compass with teaching, is that I would never ask students to do something that I wouldn't do myself. So there were some of the activities that I would join in with, because even if I looked a bit like an idiot to the students, I thought it was better to do that, because then they could see that actually I'm human as well, and that actually it made us built that sort of rapport. To ensure that the whole situation was voluntary in itself, is that I'd never pick on people to do anything. And also after the sessions, they would have pre-recorded lectures which were taken from the year before, which were uploaded, that they could go back through to talk about the content or the legal side of the sessions. As I noted at the beginning, I'm not sure if it's gamification, game-based learning, or whether it's actual playful learning. But I'm going to talk you through now just some of the examples of what I chose to do. So some of it is very basic and looks, I don't know how to explain, it just looks a bit bizarre, but it actually worked very well. So the first session that we did, and this would have been their first workshop, so they had an introductory lecture and then a workshop after that. And the premise of the session was, what is law, essentially, and getting them to think a bit more critically about law, and in particular would then bring in discussions around morality and where we sort of draw the line with what should or should not be legal, or etc. So the first sort of task that I got them to do was to draw what they considered to be the law. So I've always posed this question previously to students, what is law? And we've come up with loads of different answers, but I thought, well, why not do something different and get them to draw it? There was a bit of apprehension at the beginning, because they all think, well, that's a bit strange, never been asked to do this. But I reassured them that you don't have to share your pictures, and those that are shared on the screen are the ones that have given me permission to do so. And I gave them roughly 20 minutes to do this. I said you could talk amongst yourselves. You won't know each other perhaps at this moment in time, so introduce yourselves, and then I put the radio on. And for the most part, they all got into it, and actually found it quite fascinating. And what was particularly important after this, after they'd drawn their pictures, is we then challenged some of what they had drawn, and in particular the gavel, which did come up on probably the majority of people's what is law posters, and talked about some of the perceptions that are put across in the media about law that isn't necessarily true. And we also talked about how all of us had different perceptions of, when we said law, we all came up with a different idea of what we consider law. And we talked about how that's probably influenced by our own backgrounds. Here in the right hand corner, which is slightly hidden, is my own horrific drawing. So I made it clear that, do you know what, I've not really thought about this myself, and I deliberately didn't think about it when I was planning the session about what I would draw. I'm going to draw for myself, and then I was the first person to present, and I am horrifically bad at drawing. So it made it quite nice that they could see that side, and that I was trying to do something that was different, but not something that I wasn't unwilling to do myself. The second example then I've got here is essentially a board game called Legislate. So when I attended the creativity in the law school, Stephen introduced the board game that he uses in banking law, and that got me thinking about, well, how can I sort of incorporate this into my own teaching? So my husband, who is very much into his games, I spoke to him and we had conversations. I then reluctantly joined him in shops that sell mainly Dungeons and Dragons stuff, but also do board games, to see if there was anything in there that can influence my teaching. And just by actually having a look, and I think it was Stephen that was saying that you don't have to actually reinvent the wheel. I came across this game, Legislate. So from the outset, I didn't create it. It was created by the civil service to teach civil servants how legislation is made. And it's then been reproduced under a creative license online for you to print off. And that's what I did. And I know it looks quite horrific in that it's just printed on paper, and all the questions and etc. are all just paper based. But actually during the session, the students actually quite enjoyed it, and it became quite competitive to try and get to the end. Beforehand, I'd asked them to think about a law that they wanted to change or wanted to create, so that they were then trying to get their law through the different stages. And we got them in groups, and I think one thing is it was slightly more complicated than it probably could have been, and that would be something that I would look at changing in particular going forward. Then the last one, and this, like I said, this is very much influenced by Ali and her Taskmaster initiative. It was statutory interpretation, and the classic getting them to have a think about how they can interpret different instructions. So I did try to create it a little bit like Taskmaster with some stamps that were lying around my house that clearly belonged to my husband and not me, to try and make it a little bit more fun. And they were set a number of different tasks. So I think there were 4 tasks in total. And one of them that I got them to do, which is what the picture that you can see on the slides, was this idea of hook a fish or catch a fish. And I put a line on the floor with tape, and then they were given these very cheap plastic catch a fish elements, and they were told quite simply, catch a fish, you cannot stand past the line. Obviously the key word there was stand, and then they were asked to then try and complete that, and everyone was allowed, I think it was 3 goes each, to try and get a fish. And it was interesting. Again, I left them to it whilst they did this and just sort of wandered around the room. And the laughter in the room is probably one of my favourite teaching sessions I've ever done. Was fantastic, and everyone was very much getting on board with it. And they did eventually work out that stand meant that there was nothing stopping them, for example, crawling or lying on the floor. And it was a good way to sort of get them thinking a little bit more outside the box. And then the task progressed from there to a different one where they had to try and get a ball in a cup. And what they hadn't noticed is that actually there was a cup on the other side of the room that they could have just got, but they hadn't seen that. And then we went on to get them to try and create a law banning vehicles from Keele campus, and then discussing then what was a vehicle. Would if we banned just a vehicle, would that mean an ambulance couldn't come on site? And then we started getting into that discussion around statutory interpretation and the court's approach. And then the final example I can give, I'm not sure again if this would even fall within the definition of game-based learning, but I know that as someone who teaches subjects where problem questions come up quite a bit, I found this sort of approach really worked, and it was something quite different. Again, it looks very, very basic. But what I did essentially is they were given a criminal law problem question. So they wouldn't have studied criminal law beforehand. It was just a crime-based question on criminal damage, which I thought was quite basic. And they were given 8 envelopes in total. So the first envelope, on the front of it, would have a task for them to complete, or a question for them to answer. It's probably the best way to say it. So the first thing we'd talk about is that you need to try and find the actus reus of criminal damage. So to find that, you need to go to the Criminal Damage Act. So I would tell them, using legislation.gov, go to find the Criminal Damage Act. What does section 1.1, for example, tell you? And it became a bit of a competition about who could try and get it fastest. And I liked what Lauren said before about this whole winner or loser. I had to tone that down because I know those that were struggling a little bit with it were getting a bit disheartened that they couldn't find these certain elements as quick as others in the room. So we sort of toned that down, and it became very much an individual based task. So they would do that, and then in the envelope, they'd open the envelope and they would find the answer and check that their answer matched the answer that they had that was in the envelope. That worked really well in that it was a different way to try and get them to engage with a problem question, whilst also bringing in some element of play-based sort of learning with it. So just some sort of, just got a few seconds, I think, about some of the reflections of the sessions. Obviously, this was last semester. I'm still awaiting feedback, so I have put in an ethics application to do a bit more research around this, which I have put a note just before that I need to chase where that is. One of the things that I did find was timings, is that I don't think I gave enough time in places and it became something rushed. So because of the way foundation year works, is their sessions are an hour and a half, which is a bit of a bizarre amount of time to allocate. I think ideally I probably needed 2 hours. The issue with assessment link and necessity, I'm not sure now looking back that actually it was necessary to incorporate the assessment within that sort of play-based learning approach. Whether actually asking them to do a reflection at level 3 is quite hard, because it seems simplistic on the at first, but actually reflection, I would argue, is probably harder than writing an essay. Group size, so I said that I wanted a bigger group. I think I didn't anticipate us to have that many students, and I think that actually maybe I needed to rethink that. And then what in particular, this was, and like I said at the beginning, it was very much done on a budget of 0, which is why, again, some of it looks a bit cheap. Don't anyone ever look at how much I've spent on printing, though. The moment the university start checking that, I'm in a lot of trouble probably. But I do want to try and incorporate this a bit more, and I'm looking at putting funding applications in so that, for example, with the board game, that I could actually get that printed properly rather than just relying on a bit of A3 paper and a photocopier. But overall, from like initial discussions with students, they have genuinely really enjoyed it. And that they've found it very different, and in particular because they've come in at a different stage of their life, that it's been quite a nice, relaxed approach into higher education, rather than, right, go away, do your reading, come back, we'll ask a load of questions, make sure you understand it. It's been very much that relaxed atmosphere, and they've said that actually compared to other modules, and I found this quite interesting, that they've enjoyed it because it's felt relaxed. That pressure's been somewhat taken off of them, but at the same time they're still learning. So yeah, I think that's probably just about time, so I'll hand back to Tim.